preparations and going through history before the New Testament. Finally, today we get to the New Testament. So I don't want to go over the entirety of the New Testament because obviously there's a lot to it, and that's very much pastor's territory, and I do not want to infringe upon it. But I do want to cover a few highlights, things in Acts, things elsewhere in the New Testament, stuff that we're going to keep running into over and over again, as well as just some of the historical details. And then once we talk about what is in the New Testament, we'll start talking about what happens after the New Testament. So today we're going to go into both the careers of the apostles post-New Testament, like where they all go and what they do in the meantime. And I want to talk about the New Testament itself today. When I was planning this course, I definitely wanted to spend basically an entire day talking about like the New Testament, its authorship, its canon, and the attacks that it faces in contemporary life. Like, me personally, I have lots of friends who are either like supposedly Christians or who are just straight out, admittedly, atheists or agnostics, who frequently base their arguments on, the Bible is an old book, who cares? They probably got it wrong. We're going to cover that today as well. So that's kind of the overarching plan here. So first, let's talk about the New Testament and some of the things that are kind of important for our class going forward. First off, I want to stress, like, we are presented with this book again as one book, as though it is all just sprang directly from the mind of God, and it is all collected in this place. And that's very much not how it works. This was, even in the time of the apostles, something debated and frustrated, and there were conflicts over it, and there were problems in the church as early as like day 1 and 2. So I want to sort of draw attention to some of these conflicts and issues because they're going to grow as things go on. Like, what the Bible anticipates gives us a pretty good idea of how to deal with conflict in the church and around the church. But even then, we can see conflict is sort of here, even now. Like, even when you would think that it would be univocal, that everyone would have, this direct access to God's Word, it's not that clear cut. Part of it is because there isn't a New Testament at this point in time. Remember, these are the same guys who are going to write it, so, there isn't a definitive scripture as far as what Christians are supposed to do and believe. That is very much coming to be at this point in time. But I do want to sort of draw attention to a couple of the problems that are coming up as this church is being formed. And the first one is absolutely just a golden oldie from last time. There are issues in the church with Jews, Hellenists, and Gentiles. We have, it's all over the New Testament pretty clearly. Jesus has run-ins with, Jewish believers who question him. He has run-ins with sort of Greek-speaking Jews who typically conservative Jews kind of frown upon, but Jesus tends to be fairly open to. And then you've guys got situations like with the Roman centurion where a literal Gentile will come up to Jesus, express his faith, and Jesus will respond with a miracle in many cases. It is clear, even from the Gospels, that Gentiles are included in this in some way. And the definitive moment in this whole transformation is, of course, in Acts 10, when Peter receives his vision, and he goes to visit Cornelius, the Gentile, and Cornelius is brought into the church, baptized as a Christian, even though he's a Gentile. And remember, like we talked about last time, there are a lot of conflicts between the Jews and the Gentiles. There are big proscriptions throughout the Old Testament. Jews are not to spend time with Gentiles. If you hang out with them, you are unclean, and then you have to go to the temple and get ritually purified before you can participate in sacrifices for the day. It's incredibly frustrating. But remember, too, that there's also these Greek-speaking Jews in the church, like we talked about last week, these Hellenists. There are people who think the Jewish faith should go in one direction, like the Sadducees, where it's temple-focused. There's Jews who believe that it should go in a different direction, like the Pharisees, who are trying to focus on the law and on the spiritual relationship to God. And we have the Gentiles who are coming at Christianity from a completely different perspective, with no background in Judaism, wondering why Peter and most of the Jerusalem apostles are insisting on circumcision and other Jewish practices. And we see these conflicts frequently through the text. Paul regularly insists in Romans and Galatians and most of his epistles that Judaism and Christianity are not the same thing. Christianity is not just a new sect of Judaism. Christianity is open to all believers. It is the fulfillment of the law, and even though the law is not discarded, many of the principles crucial to Jewish identity at this point can be suspended for the purposes of people who follow Christ. Christ has made it so the law is no longer what you want to live up to. The law does not save, it condemns, Paul tells us. And as a result, we have Jesus. We no longer need to be 100% faithful to every little distinction of the law, which that's a really complex issue that, of course, many theologians have grappled with for centuries, and I'm not even doing it a little bit of justice. But what I want to stress here is that the gospel is spreading way faster than the Jews can keep it to themselves. Like, the Jerusalem church tends to be pretty conservative, tends to respect most of the Jewish rituals. But at the end of the day, in the big council of Jerusalem, which is documented in Acts 15, and which Paul talks about in Galatians 1 and 2, it seems pretty clear that it comes to a head. Like, Peter and Paul, sort of Peter the quintessential Jewish Christian, and Paul the quintessentially Gentile Christian, they meet, they talk, and the decision is, we're not going to insist on circumcision anymore, and we're not going to insist on most of the Jewish rituals, like the food restrictions and so on. Only things that we're going to say are, don't eat food offered to idols, do not eat blood, do not eat strangled things, and abstain from fornication, because everybody agrees that that's bad news. But this is it. Like, most of the things that make Jews Jews aren't going to be a big deal for Christians going forward. These are not going to be standards that the Gentiles are going to be held up to. Any questions about this? Because I know I'm not even doing it a little bit of justice here. Now, the second thing I want to emphasize again is this gospel is spreading like wildfire. We typically envision the spread of the gospel to be, wherever Paul went last. Like, you can turn to the back of your Bible and get that great little map that Zondervan Van always includes with Paul's missionary journeys, which I loved as a kid because you could trace all the little arrows and stuff. I swear, it's the same exact map that I had back in my New Adventure Bible back in the 90s. And that's great, but that's very incomplete. Paul's missionary journeys are super important. He very much establishes the church wherever he goes, but almost always the message has beaten him there. With Rome especially, he doesn't get there until a church is well established in Rome. All it takes, all those people who were gathered in Judea for the Feast of Pentecost and who received the Holy Spirit at this big new movement, they all went home. They were all there for the big feast. They were all pilgrims from all over the Jewish diaspora. And then they went home and they told everybody about Christ. And while it was disorganized and while it was not nearly as unified or orthodox as Paul will make it when he shows up and starts writing his letters, much of the time Christianity has gotten way farther than the apostles can contain it. Churches are springing up all over the ancient world. And that's why I wanted to stress this map. It's a great little map that I found online. It very much corresponds to our great little map on page 13 in our book. Many of the same cities are there. But what this map emphasizes is every one of these little dots and with the name attached to it is a church as of AD 70. And AD 70, we're talking about 35 years after Jesus' death and Pentecost. 37, I think, is the best estimate these days. But this is not a long time. This is one generation after Jesus. We have churches basically in every major city in the Roman Empire. It is spreading far faster than anyone can control it. And this will cause problems because there is no sort of central authority at this point. It is recognized that the church in Jerusalem has authority, but as of AD 70, there is no church in Jerusalem anymore. The Jews and the Christians are kicked out. So the central authority becomes Rome. But that'll take a while before it actually starts to be a big deal. What I do want to emphasize is that going forward, we're going to see three major centers of the Christian church. We're going to see the one in Rome. We're going to see the one in Alexandria, which is down here in Egypt. And we're going to see one in Antioch, over in Syria. Frequently, these are where the fault lines of Christian theology are going to start springing up. These are the major schools, and we'll talk about that more next week when we get into Irenaeus and Tertullian and Origen and all the big major players of the first few centuries. But keep in mind, again, the reason why Paul is writing so many of these epistles is because he is seeing that these churches are going wildly off the rails while the church is spreading. Like, in order to maintain, we all believe the same thing, we have to have some central authority that is keeping these churches in check. And Paul very much is that authority for a lot of these, especially Gentile churches. So Paul's letters are the earliest writings that we have as far as Christianity is concerned, and we'll come back to them when we talk about canon. But what we see in the epistles, as well as in the archaeological evidence and elsewhere, is certain practices become pretty common amongst the whole group pretty quickly. Either because Paul says to do them, or because they're just handed down by oral tradition, or because the people who came from Pentecost recognize that these are the major traditions. Whatever the case may be, whatever the movement is, these are the things that we see consistently in every church across the board. First off is the worship service. The worship service is structured fairly similarly in most churches. It takes a little while to develop, probably not until AD 60, 70 before it's got a fairly consistent structure. But what you can expect to find upon walking into a New Testament church is they will frequently have a reading of the Word, and they're going to kick out anyone who's not baptized, and then they're going to do communion. These are the two major functions of the church service at this stage of the New Testament church. Now, both things look rather different than what we are used to. The reading of the Word was typically like, we have this copy of a letter that Paul wrote to us or somebody nearby, and therefore we're going to read from it, we're going to discuss it. Or we're going to go back to the Old Testament, which everyone acknowledges as scripture at this point, and we're going to read it, and we're going to study it, and we're going to talk about God in that respect. But importantly, you'll notice this is not the cutoff. Just because you heard the Word does not mean that you were saved by most of these Christians' understanding. It takes a while. There is what the Catholics have sort of retroactively called the catechumenate. You have to be educated before you are ready to be baptized and ready to be introduced to the fold of the church. And that process tends to get longer and longer as the church is around for longer and longer, mostly because it's responding to various negative influences from outside, heresies and other problems. Where everything is fairly Wild West in the early couple centuries of the church, by the 3rd century and the 4th century, there have been so many problems that everyone needs to know exactly what they believe in order to be properly baptized and properly introduced to the church. Now, the reading of the Word could take any amount of time. Chances are people sat around and listened for considerably longer than the 40 minutes we're willing to offer Pastor Stewart. These services tended to happen on Sundays. Remember that a lot of the early church are also Jewish, and that means that they're not going out on Saturdays. Saturdays is the Sabbath. That means that's the holy day. They do not work, they do not travel when necessary, and the Roman Empire, for the most part, tends to respect this. It's pretty rare that you're going to hear of huge problems. Judaism is fairly well known and fairly well respected. It gets, a little bit of a pass there. But for the most part, the Christians are going to meet in the early morning, and then they're going to go to work afterwards. So not only are they going to listen to, their equivalent of Pastor Stewart talk for 2 hours, instead of going home and watching football, they're going to go directly to work for 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours, and then collapse at the end of the day, and then start their week. There is no weekend in the sense of 2 days. That's going to actually be 400 years later. We'll talk about that as well. Now, the second thing that I definitely want to bring up is where we're doing communion and how we're doing communion. Remember, Christians are not well regarded in the empire at this point. Judaism is fairly well accepted for the most part. It's tolerated, let's say. Christianity is this newfangled thing that nobody understands and nobody knows about and everybody's really uncomfortable about. And as a result, the Christians, for the most part, are in hiding. They do not have churches. They do not have reserved buildings where they meet Typically, they will meet in each other's houses, and when it becomes too dicey to do that, they start meeting in catacombs. They hang out in like the underground graveyards under the major cities, because again, Christianity is very much an urban phenomenon at this point. So this picture, for example, this is actually like an old 2nd century Christian tomb. This is where the grave would lie, and then you can see this picture of the communion above it. And this is likely because they probably ate here. They probably had their communion feast here in the catacombs. Very early on, Christianity understood that like martyrdom was one of the key things that identified and unified Christians. This is something that frequently brought people to the faith. It's something that frequently asserted what they believed. And as a result, there's sort of this cult of the dead growing up around Christianity. Being dead means being in heaven, being with Jesus, being saved in some capacity. It is jumping the gun and not waiting until the second coming. God wants you now. So as a result, Christians celebrate death. They do not see it as a fault. In fact, some martyrs run toward it. But we'll talk about that next week. Now, it will transform into something a little bit different over the next couple centuries. There will frequently become veneration of martyrs and to the point of like reverence and possibly even worship in some circumstances, especially after Constantine. But at this point, it's largely just respect. Like the honored dead of the Christian church, these are the people who taught us the Gospels. These are the people who communicated them to us. These are the apostles and the generation of believers after the apostles. Great believers who practiced and preached and died for their faith. And the church celebrates these people. Now, communion itself was not wafers or like bread passed around in a basket or anything. This was like Dr. Gonzalez, the guy who I'm mostly following, he compares it to a potluck, which seems pretty fair. Everyone brings their own food because like one person cannot provide all that food for everyone every Sunday. But it's also not like a ceremonial ritual thing. Like this is a legit meal. People sit down to a table, they eat their food together, they enjoy the meal, and they commune, and they eat bread and drink the wine together, as the Last Supper would have been. Again, we don't have a whole lot of evidence. We obviously don't know what they ate. That obviously disintegrated a long time ago, like no evidence of bones or anything. But we do know that this is something that practically every church practiced. This is like the cornerstone of Christian faith. This is one of the two things that we know about like basically every church that existed as far back as the New Testament writings in the 1st century. The second thing that is very clear is baptism. Baptism is the mark in Christianity from Pentecost on, and arguably from Jesus on, that you are a believer, that you are a Christian. And as much as I want to stand up here and say that like Methodists have a really good point, and like infant baptism is totally practiced all the way back to the early days of the church, there's zero evidence that that is the case. All of the evidence points to baptism by immersion as being the quintessential way to be baptized as early in the church as like the 1st century. And you know, I'm a crazy free-thinking liberal, so like if I could make an argument against this, I would, but I really can't on this one. This is the baptismal font at Ephesus. It is probably not the original baptismal font. We think that this one dates back to like the 5th or 4th century. But it certainly seems modeled after the same kind of baptismal fonts we see all over the Roman Empire. Anywhere in the 4th and 5th century, because most of the earlier ones do not survive. We also see in Christian writings that it frequently emphasizes you baptize by walking into the water, and you can see in the baptismal font there are actually like steps leading down into the font, and then on the way out, you go in on one side, you come in out the other. Usually you're provided with a robe, because you are baptized naked. Like this is something that generally the church agrees upon at this point. But the emphasis throughout is like you baptize by immersion if at all possible, and if not, you pour water over their heads. But there's no indication that it ever happened to like children or infants or anything of the kind. That is a relatively recent development, as far as any scholars know or can tell. Again, like, if there was another explanation, I'd give it to you, but there's no evidence. It could have happened, but if so, we don't know. So the main things that defined the church at this point were the communion feast and the baptismal font. And as a result, because these tended to be fairly secret, because Christians did not want to get like found out because the empire would be rather grumpy at them, rumors frequently spread about these practices and got very much blown out of proportion. Like people who had only heard rumors about communion would think that Christians were practicing cannibalism. So there was this old legend, which you'll find in your book, where like it was apparent there was this heresy, or there was this pagan arguer against Christianity who was trying to talk about how barbaric Christianity was, and he was saying that like apparently Christians steal unattended infants off the street and like bake them into a loaf of bread, and then they have like the new people cut into the bread. And then as soon as like this new person has realized that they've murdered this infant, then the Christians are like, now you're one of us. If you want us to keep your secret, you have to like abide by our laws. Which is not at all how this went down. This is like a radical misinterpretation of what Christianity is doing. But it's also like within the bounds of an understandable misinterpretation. Like we talk about communion as eating the body and blood of Christ. It sure sounds like cannibalism if you don't understand. So all of these rumors sort of circle around it, and as a result, the church is very much under fire for the whole of the 1st and 2nd century, for various reasons. A lot of that we'll get into next time, because that's when I really want to focus on like the heresies and the bad things that happen. For now, I want to move on to a couple of other details about the New Testament that we tend to gloss over, or that will be super important by the end of this class. So first off, I want to talk about the Ethiopian church. Like, there's one little nod in Acts 8 where, like, Philip apparently meets this Ethiopian guy and gives him the gospel, and the Ethiopian guy goes off back to Ethiopia, and they have this church. Like, I've actually been to Ethiopia, and they are really excited about their church. Like, they're really excited about the antiquity of it, the tradition of it, all of the fact that it is, like, separate from the whole schisms in Western and Eastern Orthodoxy, and just the giant mess that we're going to be talking about in the next several classes. What I want to emphasize is that it's not alone. There are a lot of churches that sort of grew up separate from the tradition that we're going to be talking about in this class. We are going to primarily concentrate on the church as it grew out of Jerusalem and Rome, as it's divided into Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and eventually splintered again into Protestantism. We're going to be talking about the church in the West. But that's just a tiny part of what God's been doing this whole time. God has planted churches in places that we have not tended. He tends to be really good at that. And while there will be conflicts down the road, and there will be like splinter factions and all sorts of mess, we'll talk about that later. What I want to stress is that while we are talking about Christian history, and I put it on the top of the PowerPoint like it's definitive and complete, it is not. Like, some of this stuff we can't even track down. Some of these churches are so old that we can't even verify how old they are. It's tricksy. So a lot of this comes with lots of asterisks. And the Ethiopian church is going to be one of them. It will be one of many churches that we're going to lose track of during this course. The second thing I want to talk about is also from Acts 8. I want to talk about Simon Magus. The tradition has it that Simon Magus is like the first Gnostic. And that doesn't exactly seem to be the case. Gnosticism isn't specifically a Christian thing. Gnosticism was very much growing out of the mystery religious tradition that we talked about last week, like the mystery religion at Eleusis. It was very much sort of coming to be before Christianity was really picking up speed. The trouble is Gnosticism latched onto Christianity and then just sort of like parasited it for its growth. So in the 2nd century, Gnosticism is going to be a huge deal, and we're going to definitely talk about it next week. But at this point, it's a little too early to say that Simon Magus is either the earliest Gnostic, or even that he's terribly representative of Gnosticism. We don't get a lot in Acts 8. Basically, Simon Magus shows up and he's like, look at me, I can do magic tricks. And Peter's like, look at me, I can do healings. And Simon Magus is like, teach me how to do that. And Peter baptizes him, and he's apparently a Christian, but then he's apparently like trying to pay Peter off to like do more Holy Spirit tricks. And Peter's like, that's not how we do things around here. Simon Magus is ambiguous in Acts 8. And that's the other thing I want to emphasize, is it's going to get ambiguous where the lines of demarcation between Christians actually are. Especially when we get into things like the Gnostic heresies and Marcion, the Donatists, all the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next few classes. Like I said at the very beginning of this course, I'm not going to rule out the possibility that people are saved until it is absolutely proven to be otherwise. In general, Simon Magus was baptized, probably a Christian. Simon Magus doesn't act like a Christian, that doesn't bode well. Do I know what to make of that? No, I'm not God. I'm sure God has figured out what to do about Simon Magus. Not my job, happily. So we're just going to leave that a big question mark for the time being. And that will often be the case with these sorts of heresies. I am going to reject them outright. If you want to take the Bible seriously, if you want to follow God and Jesus and everything that is written in this text, then you should reject these things as well. I am not going to say that, like, Simon Magus is totally saved, so it's okay to follow him. Like, no, not at all. You know better, and therefore you are responsible for more. That's the way it works. But as far as like what God does in the lives of others, I am not equipped to talk about. The third thing I really need to talk about, because it's going to become super important for so long, is John 1. So this is going to be like the one time, and I feel like a bit of a horrible person for saying this, like the worst Christian ever teaches a whole Sunday school class and literally points you to only one verse during the course of it. But for sure, look at John 1. My very old, antiquated King James says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The theological ramifications of this passage are enormous. Like, anyone who goes to seminary ends up like tearing this passage apart, translating it and retranslating it. Like, it's got this huge legacy in literature as being this famously difficult passage to translate. Like, there's this moment in Goethe's Faust where like Faust is like radically reinterpreting the way that it works. It's like this gigantic heresy and an indication of how far Faust has fallen. What I want to stress here is that this is also going to be sort of this foundational like proof text for everyone down the road. When people are sitting around saying to themselves, how does Jesus fit into this God thing? How do we have one God but also Jesus? They're going to keep coming back to this passage. They're going to keep coming back to John saying that there is this Word, and this Word is with God, but this Word also is God. And furthermore, the Word is such an important thing that it is apparently responsible for all of the creation, and nothing was created except using the Word. Keep that in mind, like reread this passage, because it's going to keep coming up. We are never going to be very far from it for the next 1,000 years of church history. Now, leaving aside the Bible for the time being, I want to talk about what happens to the apostles afterwards. Again, when Jerusalem's temple is destroyed in 70 AD because they're just sick and tired of dealing with Jews and Christians, the Roman Empire forces everybody out of the city. And as a result, the Christians have to scatter. And they end up in some interesting places. I stressed in one of the earlier classes that we end up in a church nearby, and that one kind of goes off the rails for a while, and then we find it 300 years later, and they believe something that we have no idea what it is. The apostles, for the most part, are going the four winds. At this point, in AD 70, Paul and Peter are already dead. According to the tradition, and again, major caveat on all that I'm about to say about the apostles, this is all due to the tradition after the New Testament. In many cases, it's not verified, and we have only sketchy evidence. Some of it seems to be better attested than others. But like, I'll tell you when I'm like really speculating as far as what happened to the various apostles. But the tradition is really strong that Peter ends up in Rome. Peter ends up in Rome. He becomes the bishop of Rome. That is like the overseer of the church. That's the term I'm going to be using most of the time. Episcope is the Greek term, I believe. Episkopos? I don't remember exactly. But bishop is kind of like the head of the churches in an area, as it will come down to. So like, typically, again, the churches tend to hang out in major cities. It's very much an urban religion at this point in time. So the Bishop of Rome is the bishop in charge of all of the churches in Rome, as well as all the churches in the nearby area, and eventually that will extend to like whole regions, but that'll become its own thing. The tradition is very strong that Peter ends up as the Bishop of Rome. He runs the church in Rome. The tradition is also very strong that when Nero goes and starts persecuting Christians, Peter is one of the first people on the chopping block. The story goes that Peter was condemned to crucifixion, and when told this, Peter said, "No, I am not worthy to die the same death as my Savior," and asked to be crucified upside down. So there is a very strong tradition that Peter was crucified upside down, which probably is every bit as unpleasant as you would imagine. Paul, likewise, was probably killed in the same persecution. Like, Acts tracks him to Rome, and his career gets pretty sketchy at that point. There is a strangely powerful tradition that says that Paul and Peter both made it all the way to Spain. Nobody's been able to verify this. Like, the Spanish are absolutely insistent. Absolutely. Paul and Peter totally made it to Spain, and the Spanish church is totally founded as early as Paul and Peter. No idea if that's true. Additionally, there are multiple interpretations of like Pauline history that have Paul coming to Rome and then leaving Rome and then coming back to Rome. Like, he gets off when he's accused at the end of Acts, and then like he bums around for a while and then gets busted again and gets taken back to Rome. The general understanding, whatever you understand the Pauline history to be, is that eventually Paul ends up in Rome just when Nero happens to be there, and Paul, being a Roman citizen, will not be crucified. They kill him by stabbing him to death with a sword. That's how the Romans do. Somehow that's more civilized, but you know, Roman execution practices were generally not terribly civilized. The next one I want to talk about is James. James is fairly easy to lose track of because he was not one of the 12 disciples. He was James, the brother of Jesus. And he is very much one of the major players in the Jerusalem church. Like, it seems to be extremely well documented that James was one of the major religious leaders in the Jerusalem church, especially after Peter's death. He was known as being like super benevolent and super generous to the community. Like, everybody knew this guy. Even the like leaders of the time tended to respect James even if they disagreed with him as far as his faith was concerned. Like, even the Jewish synagogue recognized James as a major leader. However, he ticked off Herod, and Herod had him beheaded in the whole destruction of the temple around AD 70. So that's it for James. He does not successfully survive any of this. Now the next one I want to talk about is really weird, and that's Thomas. Thomas's career is very ambiguous. Like, lots of people think that Thomas did various things. There is an entire Gnostic gospel attributed to Thomas, which has like zero reliability, and like nobody takes the Gospel of Thomas seriously. But there is a tradition that says that somehow Thomas made it all the way to India. And weirdly, this seems to hold up. Like, recent archaeological evidence has uncovered that there's like all of these like coins and other important like artifacts that were found in India that bear Thomas's name on them. Like, dating back all the way to the 1st and 2nd century, which is nuts. Like, everybody just kind of assumes, you know, the Indian church is old, but we don't know why, and we don't know where it came from or who started it. But all this evidence seems to suggest that, like, the king who supposedly hosted Thomas and, like, introduced Christianity to his whole, like, realm was actually a person who lived and may actually have done that. So, like with the Ethiopian church, where we're not going to be able to track it and talk about it, This is another one where like nobody knows where the Indian church came from, but it seems weirdly likely that Thomas was in fact the guy who founded it. But again, way above my pay grade to tell you exactly why or how. The last one that we definitely need to talk about is John. John's career is also kind of shrouded in mystery. He wrote lots of books. We have all these books, but scholars frequently disagree about exactly like what John was doing at any given moment. Like, he was supposedly Bishop of Antioch for a while, but also he ended up on Patmos for like the writing of Revelation, and there were multiple Johns in the church because like everybody's named John. That was a really common name even back then, much less right now. It's not entirely sure. Like, he apparently had major influence at Ephesus at one point. Like, many scholars basically boil this down to there are tons of Johns running around, which makes sense, but it's also not entirely agreed upon about how John's whole history works. What we do know is that he tended to live a lot longer than most of the other apostles. Like, the Gospel of John emphasizes at the very end of the Gospel that, like, he's not immortal. This is not the plan. Like, there is no guarantee that John is just going to, like, live forever and, you know, be there when Jesus shows up for round 2. But it seems very likely that John lived until 100 AD, which would put him at the ripe old age of 70, or, you know, considerably older, which is kind of unheard of in ancient times at all. But John's career is ambiguous, which brings me to my next point. We need to talk about the New Testament. Like, and this comes with like all of the caveats and all of the asterisks, because this is really dangerous ground that I'm treading on, and I'm absolutely acknowledging that, and I want to thread this needle fairly carefully. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, like, this is one of the primary battlegrounds that our faith is currently sitting on. People are attacking the New Testament for its reliability, for its trustworthiness. We have to be able to defend it. We have to be able to stand up and say, yeah, this book is legitimate. It holds up to scrutiny. It can be criticized, but it will stand up to anything that happens. In fact, this subject is so controversial that we can't even agree on the name of the subject. If you go to your average liberal arts college or any institution that has more of an atheist bent, they will call this New Testament criticism. Whereas if you go to a seminary or any place with a more Christian bent, they will call this New Testament introduction, because we do not criticize the Bible. It is not our job, it is above us, it is not to be judged. And again, I want to thread that needle fairly carefully. I want to present this as an introduction. My job is not to criticize this text. We are believers, we believe in the text, we believe it has authority, absolutely. We believe that it does not make mistakes, period, the end, and here we are. But I do want to talk about why we believe this, why it holds up, why this is not just us saying, you will believe this because I said so, but rather, you will believe this because I said so and because all of the evidence suggests that this is the case. To get into that, we have to talk about the canon. Why are the books in this book? Why do we all agree that we're going to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the epistles of Paul, the letters of John, and so on and so forth, but not the epistle of Barnabas, the shepherd of Hermas, for 1st and 2nd Clement, and so on and so forth? Why are those books out while these books are in? And the main thing about this is that it's not entirely clear. There was no point where, Luke came out of his chambers and was like, guys, I wrote the next canonical book of the New Testament. Here it is, folks. This is the divine inspired word of God. If he knew he was writing the divinely inspired word of God, it didn't come down in the form of a letter, him admitting that he wrote the divinely inspired word of God. Largely, it was accepted as the divinely inspired word of God through oral tradition, through recognition that this was a super important book by a super important person, and other factors at the time. But this is also a gradual process. I am very much jumping ahead in the curriculum here. We are talking about a process that is going to largely involve the next 4 or 5 centuries and not actually be closed until 500, 600 AD. There will be disagreement about this, but there will also be sort of tacit acceptance across the board. People understand and know what the important books are. People understand and know why these books are to be read during the service, but you can read these ones quietly at home, or these ones not at all, because they are dangerous and not actually orthodox. So I want to divide our discussion of the canon into sort of three categories. I want to talk about the standards of the early church, I want us to talk about the standards of the church historically, and I want us to talk about the standards now. Because when we have these discussions, it tends to, whether or not the book gets into the canon, tends to depend on which standards we are applying, and the contemporary standards are dodgy at best. So the first standard of the early church was, did an apostle write it? Like, this is a pretty no-brainer. If this person saw Jesus and said, Jesus said this, they're way more trustworthy than anyone who was born after Jesus died, or anyone who, never met Jesus, anything of that nature. So, like, the first and primary criterion people have of, is this book worthwhile, is, was it written by an apostle? Now, there are questions sometimes, was this book written by an apostle or not? So, for example, there's this very famous Apocalypse of Peter, which is circulating in the 2nd century. And everybody's like, did Peter write it? Did he not write it? We don't know, therefore it doesn't get into the book. But frequently the books that are in fact in our text are questioned as far as their authorship is concerned. We'll come back to that. The next standard is, does it hold up with everything else we've read? Like, if we know that Paul wrote this, and this, and then we find this other text, which supposedly was written by Paul, but apparently says something completely different or wildly off base. Like, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, there's a fairly famous encounter that Jesus supposedly has, where a woman comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, I want to be saved. I want to be one of your followers. What must I do to be saved? And Jesus is like, bam, and turns her into a man. Not theologically consistent with anything that has gone before. Women can be saved all by themselves. This is not how it works. Jesus is not a huge sexist. Like, that's not how this goes. So if the book of the Bible doesn't look like it fits with all the other books of the Bible, it's probably not inspired, probably not apostolic, and will be rejected by the early church. Now, the historical standards are a little bit different. Again, when you are in 1st century AD and you actually know the guy who knew Jesus, it's fairly easy to figure out, like, is this book the Bible or not? As happens over hundreds of years, you kind of lose track of who knew who and whether or not, like, this guy actually knew this guy, actually knew this guy, actually knew this guy, knew this guy, etc., all the way back to Jesus. So historically, there's a little bit more question and a little bit more attempt to get one's sources together and figure out if those early criteria of apostolic authorship and theological consistency hold true. So the first thing is attestation. Did a guy know Jesus? Did a guy who knew Jesus talk to the guy who we know now in some capacity? Or the guy who we know historically? One of the major standards that the church has used to decide the reliability or veracity of the books of the Bible is they look at how early were they quoted. So for example, like Clement of Rome is one of the early bishops of Rome after Peter. We place him at about the turn of the 1st century, like 90 to 120, though there's some significant disagreement about like where exactly he falls. Clement of Rome quotes tons of people in his letter, First Clement. And if he quoted, like, Paul's Romans, then we know that Romans had to have been written before Clement wrote his epistle. And as a result, that puts it far enough back in time that we know that this was a book, this was how it looked, this is what it said, and therefore we can generally agree, this was a book that appeared at about the right time. So one of the major criteria that historians will use over the ages is they will say, what is the earliest that this book is quoted, or appears, or is remarked upon by one of the other major leaders of the church that we know and can verify. And if it is well attested, if like dozens of theologians are talking about Romans, then we know Romans is legit. Whereas if only like 2 or 3 know about it, then it's a little bit more ambiguous. The next one is the tradition. Does the church recognize this book? Does it go back a long period of time? Does Eusebius talk about it? Do other historians in like the first few centuries of the church's history know this book, know where it came from, or believe that it came from the place that it proposes to be from? Like attestation, if the tradition is old enough, if it's storied enough, if it's rigid enough, presumably it's because it's actually based in fact, and therefore we can trust where this came from. The third thing is whether it was included in the canons of the time. As early as the 2nd century, we get people starting to make up lists of books that are important for Christian knowledge and the faith. Now, not all these canons are reliable. The perhaps earliest canon that we have intact is Marcion's canon, and Marcion is a grade A heretic. In fact, he specifically omits numerous books because he doesn't like them. Like, he's a big fan of the Gospel of Luke, except that he cuts out all the bits about the Old Testament, because part of Marcion's philosophy is that, like, Old Testament stuff is out, and that's the result of, like, the bad God, whereas New Testament stuff is in, and that's the result of the good God, which we'll get to next week. But it still means that these were important letters that were circulating at the time. So when Marcion says, yes, I include the Gospel of Luke, we know, well, Luke must have been a thing. It must have been well established back then. Everybody must acknowledge that Luke was a big deal. When he says Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, etc., we say, okay, so these were also important books in the Christian tradition. They were also well attested. There's also another canon that we just found like 300 years ago, like, brand new. The Muratorian canon, which is this tiny, like, fragmentary piece of old text that is, like, ripped apart and in bad shape, but it also includes a list of the books of the Bible. It's also incomplete because it's like ripped to shreds and we don't have that much of it. But it does include a lot of the major books. Again, it includes 4 Gospels. We don't know what the first 2 are because they're like on the wrong side of the page. But we know that it's Luke and John, and we can assume Matthew and Mark are the other 2. It lists almost all the Pauline letters. It lists numerous other books. It also doesn't list some. But maybe it's because, you know, the manuscript is in bad shape. Maybe it's for other reasons. At the very least, if it attests it, that's a good thing. Likewise, once heresies start spinning up, there's a lot of effort to canonize. When the Gnostics are saying, hey, read our Gospel of Thomas, Christians respond, actually that's nonsense, here are our Gospels. When Marcion says only Luke is reliable, the Christians turn around and say, no, we read all 4 of these. It's important to read them all. In both cases, that's their emphasis. Now, in contemporary biblical scholarship, it is more influenced by the work of Schleiermacher and contemporary theologians hostile to the church. And as a result, there are newer critical traditions that I find a little bit more suspicious, and I recommend that we do the same. These are the contemporary standards. And while they are used pretty much across the board, like for both secular and Christian texts, in many cases they just don't seem to make as much sense as some of the older ones here. So the first one is stylistic analysis. Like, you will see a ton of arguments in the past 150 years where a scholar will go to some books of the Bible, like the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are famously criticized by stylistic analysis. And you will like count the number of words, and you will like compare how many of those words appear in all the other books in the New Testament. And if it's like weirdly out of shape, then they're like, well, this probably wasn't written by the same person. If Paul is using like a dozen words that he never uses anywhere else in this particular book, then it probably wasn't written by Paul. And that doesn't make sense. Like, how many people in this room have written an email or a letter in the last like 2 weeks? How many people have written in the course of their lives a short story or a poem or anything of that sort? Do you use the same style? Like, would you use the same words if you addressed, say, a letter to a friend, or a letter to your boss, or a letter to your pastor, or a letter to a child? Like, we adapt our style constantly, so I've never thought very much of that particular criteria, as compelling as their numbers may be at the end of the day. The second thing is textual criticism. Like, they will compare old manuscripts and they will look for gaping holes and things that don't line up, or like possible interpolations, like things that reflect more modern theology. And while this I tend to think is a little bit more reliable, they also tend to overdo it. To give you an example, one of the most famous textual critical attacks on the Bible came in the early 20th century, where they took apart the Pentateuch and they said that it was written by like 4 different people at 4 different times for 4 different reasons. And they will literally like splice a verse in half and say this half was written by this person and this half was written by this person. And it makes no sense. It is just complete, just nonsense. It is taken to its extreme by atheists in their attempts to attack the books of the Bible. Used correctly, it can be really valuable. There are passages that we generally frown upon nowadays because they aren't well attested in the older books. Like, everyone remembers that gospel story where, like, there's the woman and she's apparently accused of adultery, and all the rabbis go up and they're getting ready to, like, stone her, and Jesus is like, let you without sin cast the first stone. And the rabbis like, oh no, they put down their stone and they walk away. And she's like, thank you, and he's like, go and sin no more. Probably not originally in the text. All the indications suggest that that's a fairly late addition to that gospel. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or that it's not supposed to be in the Bible, like God put it there, so now we're in other territory. But it doesn't appear on many of the early manuscripts, and that makes it a little bit dodgy. What I will say, though, is that these tend to not be a big deal as far as our theology is concerned. Like John 1, extremely well attested, trust me. Like, you will not have any one of these textual criticisms creep in at any point where it's like, NPS, Jesus is God. Like, these are super important things, and they are well attested. They are in all of the manuscripts. There are very few legitimate textual criticisms that really, like, hold up to scrutiny. But because I do want to give a sort of complete approach to this, because I do want you to, like, go home and be able to say, your arguments against my Bible are nonsense, I do want to break this down a little bit deeper. So I want to talk about the actual process of the authorship and how this book looks to contemporary scholars, both Christian and atheist. First off, let me stress, no right-thinking scholar, like nobody in their right mind, no matter how much they've studied this book, have ever seriously questioned Romans, the Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Thessalonians, and Philemon. Like, these are just rock solid. No reputable scholar that I have found will question those books. They are almost guaranteed to be written by Paul. Like, I cannot stress this enough. And to stress again, like, this is very much the gospel. Like, you can recreate basically everything you need to know about Christianity from those books. Like Romans and Corinthians especially, they are just such rich theological troves. But I do want to talk about the other categories as well. Those are our rock solid ones, but many of the books in the New Testament are also questioned. There are numerous scholars out there who believe that there are problems with the text for whatever reason, or that, like, the person who is supposed to have written it has not written it, or there are, like, other issues. But for the most part, they are shouted down. Anything in the second category, it's a minority opinion that tends to think that the book is problematic. And that minority is almost all, like, hardcore atheists who are definitely trying to attack this book and clearly have an agenda of their own. First off, the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It also includes Acts, because Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. Most scholarship surrounding the Synoptic Gospels is about where did it come from. You'll notice if you read all four Gospels back to back, first off that John is very different, and that's why it's not included in the Synoptic Gospels. But also you'll notice that there's a lot of redundancies. Like Matthew and Luke cover all the same ground that Mark does. The suggestion at this point in time is that Matthew and Luke both knew of Mark's gospel and therefore included like 99% of it in their gospels. They quoted it verbatim over and over and over and over again. So with that in mind, Mark was probably the earliest of the gospels to be written. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, but Professor Kozlowski, why Mark? He wasn't an apostle. The tradition has it that Mark was the amanuensis and the student of Peter. And therefore, the Gospel of Mark is supposedly as close as we're going to get to the Gospel of Peter. And that's why it tends to have even greater precedence. Like scholars, as a rule, when they're questioning, like, did Jesus actually do this? They go to Mark first. If it's there, then it's almost guaranteed. Matthew and Luke have Mark as their source. They also have another source, because there are a lot of agreements between Matthew and Luke about things that aren't even in Mark. So most scholarship these days point to another document, which they frequently call Q, which is apparently like a list of Jesus' sayings or famous passages or stuff passed down through the oral tradition, which Matthew and Luke both came upon and then copied into their text. However, they were more free with their translation of Q, which is why like those passages tend to be very different from Matthew to Luke. In all three cases, though, there's not a lot of good reason to doubt that the people whose names appear on your Bible page aren't the people who wrote them. Like, Luke shows every evidence of being a dude who hung around with Paul. Matthew absolutely sounds like a Jewish disciple of Jesus, and Mark absolutely sounds like he knows exactly what he's talking about. These are typically not terribly scrutinized. There are atheist scholars with an agenda and an axe to grind who are going to attack these writers and say they didn't write them. But generally, all three of these books are extremely well attested, they're extremely well and early attested, and as a result, it's really hard to doubt that they're not apostolic in origin. The Johannine works, on the other hand, are way messier. And by this I mean anything supposedly written by John. John, the three epistles of John, and Revelation. Now, there is no reason why John could not have written all of these books. Like, there is no reason whatsoever. But a lot of scholars nowadays are frequently questioning whether John wrote them or whether they're like all the same John, whether like 3rd John was written by some other John, because again, there are all these Johns hanging around in the New Testament. Additionally, like a lot of people question that John was around for all that time. And therefore, Revelation in particular is questioned as to whether he was like a different John altogether. So you have like John the Apostle and John the Revelator, who was the guy who wrote Revelation, no relation to the original John. There's also a big push to understand that there's like a whole Johannine school growing up in Ephesus around Antioch, and that's like their particular theological bent, and that all these works reflect that. I don't know. I don't think it holds up terribly well. Again, I don't think there's any reason not to believe that these were written by John. All of these arguments are speculative at best. They are suggesting things for which there is no evidence, whereas the tradition, the attestation, tends to be very strong. The other trick about the Johannine works is that they tend to be fairly recent. They're all lit, written in like AD 70 to 100, depending on where they date it. And trust me, the atheists tend to prefer to date it much later because then there's more evidence that it wasn't by the original guy. So again, probably all John, but a lot of people are sort of questioning that these days. James and Jude are weird. Like, they're weird anyway, because they're just completely from different perspectives as many of the books in the New Testament. Personally, I think that actually makes them super important because we do get other people's opinions. Plenty of scholars have questioned both James and Jude as to whether they were written by James or Jude, but weirdly, they are also kind of super well attested. Lots of people quote them, lots of people talk about them. I don't believe that they appear in the Muratorian canon, that really early one, and Marcion hated these guys because they're super Jewish, and as a result, like, nope, Marcion's not going to have it. But generally speaking, there's no reason to doubt James or Jude either. A lot of the reason why people attack them is that same stylistic analysis that came before. Both James and Jude seem to be written by eloquent Greek speakers, and these scholars, being the elitists that they are, they assume that like people born in Judea and hanging out in Judea couldn't write good Greek, which is just like very elitist. There is some evidence of that, like the Septuagint has a very different Greek style than most like Attic Greek. But even then, to say that like a Jewish person could not learn to write proper Greek is just bad and mean and dumb. So James and Jude are probably pretty reliable. 2 Thessalonians is a huge mess because Paul says, like in the body of the letter, I and Titus and Timothy, we all wrote this together. And this drives scholars nuts, because they're all looking at like, oh, this doesn't match with 1 Thessalonians, and it doesn't match with the other Pauline books, but it doesn't say that it's written by Paul, so is it a stylistic because of the other writers, or is it something else? And most of the time they just reject it out of hand, because, again, they're trying to cast their doubts on this. Again, when you are in a situation this complicated, the correct thing to do is to trust the tradition in your other sources, the attestation, and so on and so forth. 2 Thessalonians, like 1 Thessalonians, is well attested, so it's fairly reliable. Colossians and Ephesians, this is the dumbest one of the bunch. Like, I cannot express to you how weird I find the whole Colossians-Ephesians debate. Like, if you think that it's kind of silly for the scholars who are arguing for stuff like 2 Thessalonians, it doesn't look enough like Paul to be Paul. Colossians and Ephesians, they're too much like each other to be Paul. So on the one hand, it's like, it's not enough like Paul, and now it's too much like Paul. Like Paul can't work off his old drafts or something? Like, come on, guys. So Colossians and Ephesians, they look too similar, and as a result, we don't like them. But that's dumb. So Colossians and Ephesians, I have no problems with, and absolutely you shouldn't either. 1 Peter is the other one. 1 Peter, like James and Jude, is apparently very eloquent Greek, and as a result, everyone's like, oh, Peter couldn't possibly have written that, despite the fact that he lived in Rome for like 20 years, apparently, according to the tradition. So once again, it seems to fall apart. 1 Peter seems perfectly reliable. There's no reason to think that it wasn't written by 1 Peter. It's well attested. It's in the Muratorian canon. Marcion deliberately rejects it, which means that he knows about it, which means that it was there back in the 2nd century. So it's probably been there the whole time. Now, the next category are the ones where the balance is starting to tip. These are all examples of scholars who question these books, but are largely shouted down by the majority of scholars, both atheist and Christian, who don't see any reason to doubt these things. These sets of books, however, there are probably more doubters at this point than there are adherents. It is only Christians and only Christians engaged with like preserving the tradition that tend to stand up for these. So I will tell you right here, like if people are going to call you out and say the Bible isn't trustworthy, this is where they're typically going to do it, if they know what they're talking about. The first one is 2 Peter. 2 Peter is the worst attested book in the canonical New Testament. Like, nobody until something like the 3rd century quotes 2 Peter. There's no good evidence that anybody in the 2nd century was quoting from 2 Peter. It doesn't appear in the Muratorian canon. It doesn't appear in Marcion's canon. And it has been argued by many scholars that 2 Peter is deliberately refuting Gnostic heresies, which we place into the 2nd century at the very least. Again, this is all speculative. In an absence of evidence, the atheists tend to push their agenda and the Christians give way. Again, it is doubted. It is also still really well attested. Like I said, in the 3rd century, there are people talking about 2 Peter. It's a thing. People who attribute it to Peter. It could very well have been around. But this is one that people will fight you on. The other one is the pastoral epistles. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. There was a book by, I want to say it's like N. Harrison back in the 40s or 50s, where he did like this very systematic stylistic analysis of the pastoral epistles and rejected the Pauline authorship of it. He was like, nope, they were written too late, they were written to, totally different purposes. But that's the thing, the pastoral epistles are to Timothy and Titus. They're not to churches, they're to friends of Paul. And as we said, anytime that you're doing stylistic analysis, you're assuming that people can't write 2 different ways. Paul uses a lot of new language that he doesn't use in the other books, and therefore everyone's like, oh, these are not legitimate. I'm not sure that that holds up. They are not terribly well attested. Again, not on Marcion, not on Muratorian, but they are well attested after the 2nd century. The fact of their being questionable is due to the lack of evidence, not evidence against them. But what I want to stress is that literally everything on this list, everything that is in the canonical New Testament, has way better evidence for its being in the New Testament than anything outside of it. Like, there are miles between 2 Peter and the Epistle of Barnabas. Like miles. Radical theological differences, way better attestation, and at the end of the day, if somebody is going to come up to you and say, I don't believe the Bible because, after 2,000 years people got it wrong, maybe they mistranslated it, maybe somebody affected it, maybe the church has been secretly scheming to put their own agenda into the Bible, you can tell them, all right, I'll give you 2 Peter, you give me Romans. Because everyone agrees that Romans was Paul. And if you're going to doctor the entirety of the Bible for your own agenda, why wouldn't you start with Romans? Why would you start with 2 Peter and Timothy and Titus? There's not a whole lot of huge, weighty, unique theology in these works. And these are not the ones that we tend to stand up and, talk about. This is not the foundation of the Christian faith. You want the foundation of the Christian faith? Here it is. You want to present your big mustering of arguments for why those books are wrong? Go ahead, do your homework, and we can talk. But until they do, don't give them the time of day. If they really want to push you and say, the Bible is legitimate, it was written by, people in the 6th century trying to, brainwash you. No. There are literally 2nd century scriptures, documents, evidences, quotes, all over the place. Things that date back to within 100 years of these things being written, saying these things were things. It is way more trustworthy than any other ancient document, and it is scrutinized way more deeply as a result. There is an agenda here. This is a fight. So keep that in mind. Now, on the other side, we also have Hebrews. Nobody knows where Hebrews came from. Nobody knows who wrote Hebrews. If you were all sitting looking at my big list and saying to yourself, well, what about Hebrews? I don't know about Hebrews. There's a long tradition that says that Paul wrote it, but, I translated works of Paul and Hebrews, and this is the one place where on my stylistic analysis I'm yeah, that's different. That's a completely different approach, a completely different set of argumentation. Generally, nobody agrees that Paul wrote it these days. The Orthodox Church insists that it's Pauline. They're the only ones. So nobody knows who wrote Hebrews, but Hebrews also doesn't tell us who wrote it. So it's safe. We're good. Whoever wrote it, they are not lying about not being nobody. But that's it. Hebrews is very much the exception in this case. Its authorship is unknown. And we're cool with that because it absolutely holds up theologically. It stands with the rest of the canon, and it is old enough and well attested enough that it clearly came from a source in and around the apostles, even if it wasn't apostolic itself. Then there are the other ones. First Clement, the Gospel of Thomas. There are lots of reasons why these get rejected. Clement, for example, I like Clement. Clement of Rome is awesome. He wrote First Clement, and then he did not write probably any of the other stuff that apparently bears his name. There's a lot of question there. But First Clement is solid theologically. It quotes a bunch of Pauline letters. It's really interesting. It's really good. Not in the New Testament. Clement is not an apostle. Period. The end. Great theologically, very well attested, likely dating back to the same place. Don't care, not an apostle. He's out there. Gospel of Thomas, we talked about. Whether or not Thomas wrote it, it is way off the mark as far as the theology for everything else is concerned. So while Gnostics and other contemporary scholars may say, but what about the Gospel of Thomas? The correct response is the Gospel of Thomas is nonsense, was not written by anyone who knew Jesus, please leave me alone. And scholars do this, especially, you get those undergrads who have gone to their first theology or world history or world religions class, and they come out guns blazing, they're like, I know more about Christianity than you do. No. The Gospel of Thomas is nonsense. Nobody takes it seriously. Please stay away from Gnosticism. And cigarettes are bad for you. The Shepherd of Hermas is actually really cool. It is pastoral in nature. It is meant to sort of be an encouragement and stuff. We don't know who Hermas is. We don't know how trustworthy he is. But we also know it's very well attested, but it's very well attested with asterisks. The Muratorian canon specifically says, the Shepherd of Hermas is great. Everybody should read it at home, not in church. That's not where it belongs. And that's kind of the point here. Like, I'm sure that if you talk about your own personal library, you've got tons of books on there by contemporary Christian scholars or good theological writers or inspiring thinkers. That's fine, great. We may bring them up in church, like if they provide a good example or if we think they're worth studying, but we do not recognize them with the same authority as the Bible. And in the early church, we only read the Bible because that's the best authority and we're trying to get this word out there as much as possible. So Shepherd Hermas is great, not in the canon. By all means, look it up and read it. The Epistle of Barnabas, almost certainly not written by Barnabas. It is very weird and very allegorical, and will definitely tie into the Alexandrine school of our next lecture. So there's a lot of baggage to go along with the Epistle of Barnabas that we'll talk about later. But again, what I want to emphasize overwhelmingly, because again, I'm trying to thread that needle, our Bible is like crazy strong when it is scrutinized, when scholars attempt to attack it. It is very rare, again, 2 books, that it is even open to serious doubt and question. Most of the stuff on that question list, there's like one school in Tübingen that is just like guns blazing trying to take down the authority of every single biblical work. And I think like half the Johannine works, 2 Thessalonians, and 1 Peter, it's like only them who are trying to take it down. One little school amongst tons of scholars studying this stuff, trying to make their careers off it. It holds up. Do not be afraid to assert that. If somebody comes at you and says, I don't believe the Bible because it's too old, or because I don't trust the apostles, or because of whatever reason, hold them to it. Like, don't be afraid to defend this book. It absolutely stands up to scrutiny. And even if they push you, even if they, push you as far as you can say every scholar on the face of this earth, with like the exception of a couple of really crazy people, hold up the main things that I hold most dear. And if you can't build Christianity out of that, then you're not doing it. So it takes a little while for the church to figure out exactly what falls in which category, like what gets to be in the rejected list, what gets to be in the accepted list. But all of these books are being read and reread throughout the history of the church. Like the canon may not be solidified until the 6th century. By the 3rd, virtually everybody agrees on everything in this list, and it's just a matter of formalizing it. And as early as like 70 AD, virtually everything on that list is being read and held to be true. It's astonishing how well evidenced it is, honestly. So stand by it. Like, I do. Occasionally gets me in trouble. I try and teach the whole picture every time. But any questions? Because I know I've again, gone about an hour and not stopped and broken. Anyone chomping at the bit to take me down? Anyone? No? Well, if Don's happy, then I imagine we're doing all right. All right, in that case, go, be free. Oh!
I do have a question.
Go for it.
On the Johns that we're talking about, is
Yes.
there evidence to suggest that there is more than one John who wrote these things besides John the Baptist? That
Yeah.
supports that causes it out?
Mostly that it's just a common name. There is at least one ancient scholar who suggests that there is a different John of Patmos than another John, but that's it. It's mostly speculation on the part of contemporary scholars that, again, this was a super common name. Like you said, John the Baptist has the name, John the Apostle has the name. There are lots of Johns attested throughout, the Roman Empire at this point. So this seems to be the most elegant solution to them, because God forbid that one dude write all of this stuff. But generally, no. It's most of our earliest scholars, most of the earliest people who talk to these books, like the Muratorian canon, they see all of these were written by the same guy, and that guy is John, the Apostle, the one who was beloved by Jesus. So it is very strong that it is just John, and not 4 different Johns. Other questions? twice. Tom?
Some of that, a lot of the differences in ages of disciples.
Oh yeah, like most of them are about the same age. Like Jesus picks up all of his disciples in their like late teens, early 20s for the most part. There might be a couple of exceptions. If Matthew was a tax collector, it probably means he was a little advanced in age. And for sure, they lived to different ages. Like John, like I said, he lives to probably be 80 or 90 even, based on how late he writes some of these works, and how well established the rest of the canon is at the time. Most of these Christians die early, though, and they don't die peaceful deaths at home. Like, they die because they are martyred. Like we said, Peter and Paul, they die in AD 50, probably at the age of 40 or 50, because Nero is done with them. But we'll talk about that next week. Anything else? All right, for next week, we'll talk about the first 2 centuries and all of the correspondent heresies and all the major thinkers who start to radically shape the way that Christianity works. We'll talk about big persecutions like Nero and like Trajan. We'll talk about Roman policy regarding Christianity, and we'll talk about all that good stuff. So tune in next time, and we will get there.